on the following topics. Identity is one of them. There is another question on organisational structure stroke behaviour. There is a question, it's going to be a question on conflict and power. There's a question on culture. And a question on team working, but it's quite a specific question. I can't say how specific it is. So it is a very specific question. I'm not allowed, obviously, to tell you what the questions are. So it's a very specific question on team working. Now, having told you that, I think it would be very risky to only revise 2 topics. I think you're going to need to revise 3 so that you're able to answer 2 of the questions, yeah? And in terms of revision, I think that you need to read apart from this lecture, which isn't really covered in there's some discussion about identity in the culture chapter, but there are readings associated with this, and I have given you a very, very long lecture on this. It probably bored you to tears, but so if you did want to do identity, it's basically a need to read the academic papers that I've selected for you. For all the other topics, it's not sufficient to read just the core text. You should demonstrate evidence of wider reading, which, again, there are readings associated with each topic. One thing, I talk about the need, these need to be, these are essay questions, and you have an hour to do each one. Now, I have to say there is a direct correlation between people leaving the exam early and getting a poor mark in the exam. I don't write the time that people leave in the exam paper, but whoever is invigilating will write, if you leave early, and I'm telling you all this for a reason, they'll write the time you left. Now, I don't hold that against people at all, but what I'm saying is you have an hour to write each answer. And I think it's important that people spend at least 10 minutes trying to plan an essay that they're going to write. It isn't a case of write everything you know about organisational culture or everything you know about organisational or about identity, because that won't be answering the question. And at master's level, it's very important that you answer the question. Yeah? So, yes.
Are all questions equal? I mean, the grades?
Yes. Yes. One of the questions is split into 2 parts, but it clearly states.
So
yeah,
all of them are equal.
Yeah, they're all equal, and you have free choice. And they say answer 2 questions. So you can't, if you're going to answer the question that's split into 2 parts, there'll be 25 marks each for that question, for those 2 parts. One thing I've noticed with people answering 2-part questions is they start to repeat themselves. The 2 parts, I don't, obviously I always include a 2-part one. I sometimes include 2 2-part questions. You might think they're easier because you've got less to write on one part of the question. But what you've got to be very clear in your own mind about is that you know the difference between the 2 parts of the question, that you're not going to start repeating yourself. Because I can't give you marks if you start saying things you said in the first part of the question, because you said it once, and the second part or the first, they are distinctive parts. So don't see that naturally as the easiest question. I don't know whether other people say this, but we never aim to take marks away. It's what we're doing in an exam is looking to give you marks. So I am, as I say, it's not a case of writing down everything you know about a certain subject, because if something isn't relevant to the question, I'm reading your answer, and if I can't see the relevance, and I may read the essay several times, then all that will happen is I'll put a question mark by it, and a question mark basically means I haven't been able to give you any marks for that, because it's not contributing to answering the question. And I suppose that's the big difference at master's level, is there has to be a difference. I mean, I argue, I'm talking to my undergraduates this afternoon, and I'll be more or less saying the same thing to them, but there is a little bit more leeway around them demonstrating their knowledge. At master's level, you will be given an essay question, and it could be critically evaluate this statement, it could be discuss a statement, it could ask you what, I mean after the break, after the Easter break, we'll actually look at a couple of questions and you can see how to prepare for it. But they all demand an answer that is targeted. So when I say I think all of you have got you should at least spend 10 minutes planning what goes into your essay answer. Yeah? And a good answer will have an introduction, a middle, and a conclusion.
Is it necessary to cite in there?
Yes, I don't hold it against people if they get the years wrong, but if you're going to provide definitions, then clearly you need to cite the definition. And yeah, I mean, if people get distinction level, if people produce distinction level work, they will cite correctly. When I was an undergraduate, I was told that, I was told I wanted to do well. I wanted a first class honours degree, and because I wanted a scholarship to do a master's. And the only way I was going to get a scholarship was to get a first. And I was told at Warwick that if I wanted a first, then if I cited and I should cite to the extent of using quotes and be able to quote the page number as well. And I still didn't know what the questions were going to be about, so I might have learnt some quotes that I could never use, you know? So I'm saying that revision is about developing a good understanding of the area.
I'm just not sure if when you mean like citing the definition, would you mean like citing exactly what it says in the book, or citing like the idea of the person?
Well, if
you cite the definition, it's just like, it's just, you just have to memorize it. It doesn't really.
Yeah, you just have to memorize it. But if people provide definitions, and you're writing an essay, you would have to say. I mean, if you gave me a definition. I'm sure I gave you about half a dozen different definitions of culture, because I actually argued, for example, that different research academics place a different emphasis on different aspects of culture. So Peters and Waterman say it's largely conveyed through communication. Jacques says that it's not shared by everybody. Then if you took that example, you might want to give one or two definitions, but a good answer, if you just gave me the definition, that would say nothing to me. It would say, oh yes, I can give you a mark because you've defined culture, but you haven't explained why you've given me two definitions. If the question, all I would say is, and some people still do well without giving me precise definitions, but they give their own definition. They cite, so they say culture, organisational culture is da-da-da-da-da-da, and they put it in their own words, but they put references to the original authors. And if their interpretation of culture is correct, then I can give marks, yeah? So I'm not suggesting that you, I don't think it's too difficult to learn a few definitions, but this ultimately isn't a memory test. It really is about demonstrating your understanding. And when I say that, I mean both in this module, but probably more so in the Knowledge and Innovation Management module. I think you can draw on on different parts of the module in answering a question. There clearly is a link between culture and identity, and there happen to be two questions in the paper. But you couldn't draw too heavily on culture in the identity question. But that's not to say you couldn't say culture and identity are inextricably linked, you know? So, I mean, my advice, and I always say this, and I see students do this, my advice is that in order to prove or demonstrate to yourselves that you do understand a topic well enough to go into an exam under timed conditions and write a reasonable answer to the question, is I would practice writing an essay. If you think you know, I mean, we all make notes, we all test ourselves, but test yourself at master's level on actually trying to write a 40-minute essay. Try sitting there and writing for 40 minutes. Make up a question, you know, and see how you can answer it. I mean, you don't have to do this, but I'm just trying to give you tips as to how to do well, yeah? Because I'm sure if you revise very hard and you really struggled with the actual question, but you'd revised hard and you knew the topic, you could probably get 50-55%, which is pass. But you wouldn't get 60, 70, 75%. And I don't, you know, I mean, I've marked exams for years and years and years. So, and it's also not about quantity, because some people write pages, but they've gone off. They've gone off on what I refer to, so they've gone off on a tangent. There could be a question about team working, and the thing they know really well is groupthink. So they spend 90% of the question talking about groupthink, whereas actually perhaps it's about far more than groupthink. You know what I mean? And I can only give so many marks for talking about groupthink, can't I? You know? And it might, another sort of tactic that people, not a good one. It's good to include organisational examples. And there's two types of questions. Not every question will say using organisational examples. But the difference between those two types of questions, so some will say using organisational examples or with reference to organisational examples. If the question says that, then I expect to see one or two organisational examples that we will have covered in the lecture or in the seminar, explained in detail. If the question doesn't ask for organisational examples, but this is an organisational theory course, then you will draw on it, you will use it, you will probably use organisational examples, but there you will only use them briefly, yeah? Because the question is that you will be using them to briefly illustrate something an argument you're trying to make, yeah?
What kind of word is it?
You have a time limit. But I see it.
No, I don't know.
It's not, no, I've seen people, I say this and then I think I get told off sometimes. I think you have to write it in. I discovered that I write fastest in pencil, and I chose to write, when I was doing exams, I wrote in pencil because I could write a lot quicker.